Chapter 1. The Waking. I told you I cannot induce him to wake up. His body is under immense stress right now, and if I do... He paused. You won't get any answers. The hesitation was self-explanatory. There was a sigh of frustration on some sort of speakerphone, followed by muffled conversation. Everything felt numb, and the light directly above him blurred any attempt to focus. The voices in the room, the lights, his aching limbs and throbbing in his skull, it was all present, but yet numb. He laid still, unable to move his arms, but also lacking the strength to do so. He listened more intently, focusing on the man's voice. He was in the room, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. There were other voices, 2 men and a woman. He heard the tones, but not the words as they increased in volume, engaged in an argument. Hal groaned and tried reaching for his face. Everything still felt intact as his palms patted his skin. His eyes ached as his fingertips gently touched an adhesive cloth covering them. He gently pulled, wincing, and let out a sigh of pain. "Claire, I think our patient just woke up." The man's voice was only a few feet away now. Hal immediately stopped and turned defensively. Even with his eyes covered, he could sense the man approaching. "Mr. Brent, can you hear me?" His tone was gentle. "Here, let me help you with that." A warm hand touched his face, and Hal jumped back, swatting away the doctor's hand. "Stay back!" He wasn't going to volunteer any information. "Why am I blindfolded?" "Mr. Brent, I'm Dr. Prossman, and I'm the station's doctor here." He sounded confused, but didn't make any second attempts to touch his face. "You're on a research base here on Soldier Key. We found—" "Soldier Key? In the Atlantic?" he interrupted him. Had he landed somewhere in the Florida Keys? "Mr. Brent, please, let me help you with those so that you can see." He reached again for Hal's face, and with a slight flinch, Prossman pulled the slim piece of webbed tape from his eyelids. "Sorry about that. You had a seizure when you first arrived, and your pupils were dilated. The webbed tape was to keep the light out." It was overwhelming. Hal hadn't seen fluorescent lights or sunlight for quite some time, and it took him a few moments before he attempted to open his eyes again. "Robert," a woman's voice came through some sort of intercom system. "Yes, Claire," the doctor replied, turning towards the intercom. "He's awake. I don't think this is a good time to tell Troy, though. He's very disoriented. Let me finish treating him before Troy hears about this." "I can't stall him for very long. If it's okay, I'd like to see him." She paused. "I'll be there in a minute." His vision was blurry, but he could see the doctor walking around what looked like a sterile sickbay. The room was well lit, a little too well lit. On the second level he could see a faint glow of electronic equipment. A single workstation stood out from the rest, littered with snack bags and pop cans, but the rest of the room was sterile enough for surgery. The doctor had a crook in his step, but busily walked towards his littered workbench. He pulled something that looked like a clipboard from the pile and began touching the illuminated surface. That was new. Hal had seen tablets before, but these were different. The entire surface was transparent and lit up the doctor's wrinkly face. "You said I'm on Soldier Key. Has my crew been found?" Hal began to sit upright, gripping the padded bed for balance. "Excuse me?" The doctor turned and looked at him with a puzzled face. He was a frail-looking man, and with the exception of a dozen white hairs, he was completely bald. Gravity had had some effects over the years, shown in his slight hunch, and he definitely wasn't a physical threat. Hal was beginning to focus more clearly on his surroundings. "How long has this place been on the island? This is a large complex for Soldier Key." The doctor laughed. "I wish I could take credit for building it, but I'm not as sturdy as I once was." The man proudly held the clipboard to his chest and puffed up, as if showing his strength and stability. "My building skills are with smaller things. Genetics." He smiled, but he didn't seem to understand the question. No, there was a large construction team some years back. Most of the complex is actually underwater." He lifted his eyebrows with interest. "What?" Hal frequently flew over the Keys, and surely he would have noticed the complex of this size before. "Ah, I bet you have some catching up to do." The doctor looked at his clipboard and touched in a few things before laying it back down on the pile of desk junk. "You see, you're at a research base on Soldier Key. This is A&H's headquarters. We dabble in a little bit of everything now, but a few years back there was this indestructible glass. Pax." He began to fidget. "I know it's a stupid name, but the makers wanted their names to be known for the breakthrough. But anyway, the construction industry, it's revolutionized how we build." Hal closed his eyes tightly and put his hands over his eyes. "Wait, when did this happen? Why am I on a research base that makes glass? Oh, we found you." His voice was still chipper, like he was some sort of prize. "You were floating on a piece of wreckage in the middle of the Atlantic." Hal's hands dropped and his eyes were wide open. "We had a search team out towards Bermuda looking for 2 of our freighters. They were heading to St. George to another small facility, but midway they lost power and just disappeared off our radar." He looked down at his hands and he began to fidget his fingers. "I'm not really at liberty to talk about it, but during our search we found you gripping onto some of the floating wreckage. Although we're still not entirely sure it was part of our ship." His eyes wandered downward in disappointment as he recalled the lost ships. The doctor still hadn't explained much, but what he had said didn't make a whole lot of sense to Hal. Why a glass company? A genetic research doctor? Was he heavily medicated or having some sort of hallucination? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Is this an okay time?" Hal could tell by the voice that she was the same woman from the intercom. "Yes, come on in, Claire. Our patient has come to life." The doctor lifted his arms with enthusiasm as if he was a miracle that had just happened and was now presenting Hal to the new audience. The woman politely smiled at Hal as she took a seat in the doctor's chair, holding a clipboard against her chest. She had dark red hair that was loosely held back by a clip and wore business pants and a white collar shirt under a lab jacket. "Mr. Brent, I'm Claire Kass. I'm one of the employees here. You're on a research station called A&H. Your doctor filled me in, but I still don't understand. Why am I here?" He looked down at his arms where there were bruises and scratch marks. She clasped her hands together. "This is going to sound a bit confusing." She paused, fussing with her pen and then making eye contact. "I don't know how to say this, Mr. Brent, but you died on August 21st, 2013. Hal froze. He looked forward, not sure if he'd heard correctly. There was a long silence and his thoughts paused, realizing she was completely serious. "You look really good for a dead guy," the doctor remarked. "You should be 71 years old by now." Claire quickly spun around, and he immediately realized it wasn't funny. "Well, I mean, never mind." "Mr. Brent, you were lost at sea and presumed to be dead." Claire rephrased her comment. She paused, considering this news must have been devastating, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. "That was over 26 years ago." Hal tried to grasp what was just being said. The words were echoing, and he still wasn't sure he'd heard them correctly. With blank thoughts, he looked at her and then to the doctor. Her expression seemed concerned and anticipating. Dr. Prossman shuffled behind Claire anxiously. He looked at Hal with fascination, trying to hold back his eager questions. He held off for a few seconds, biting his lips. He was fixated on Hal. "It's like a time warp." He stared for a moment. Claire dropped her head at the remark. Prossman was a curious man, and although his humor wasn't always sympathetic, she couldn't help but smile at his ridiculous idea. The shocked stranger didn't show any reaction. "There are going to be a few gentlemen coming in soon to ask some questions. I know you have a lot of your own, but if you can help us, we may be able to find some of those answers." Hal continued to look forward, just staring in the general direction without movement. There wasn't much she could say. There was a dead man sitting on their lab table, and aside from the ancient facts on paper, there was no explanation for his arrival. "My passengers," his tone was monotone. "I had passengers on my plane." His report was fairly short, giving the brief history of his military career and an even shorter blurb about the flight school he taught at just outside Miami. She sat back down on the bench across from him. Hal was still in a daze, but he seemed to be listening. "Your plane disappeared from radar about a mile off the coast near Bimini. The waters are fairly shallow in those areas, but no one ever found wreckage or your passengers." She avoided using the word bodies. He had enough on his mind to digest. "I'll leave you alone for a while. Dr. Prossman will stay here in case you need anything." She wasn't always the most comforting person, but she leaned forward and tried to assure him that things would be okay. "You're safe here. We'll do what we can to figure this out." Honestly, she was only trying to be optimistic.